very much, Brian, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Everybody in the back hear me? Yeah? Well, thank you, organizers, for this invitation to speak about China's climate change, which is a serious issue in the environment. So today I'd like to actually share with you some of the things I'm researching on China's climate change. So people actually call this climate change, global warming, depending on what kind of terminology you like to use. But it's a serious global issue where China has a lot of impact. And the way I actually research this is a bit of my background was already explained by Brian, but I'm a lawyer and a political scientist, and I do a lot of field work. So as obvious from my accent, I am Japanese, but I also grew up in China and also elsewhere. So basically home was basically China, and witnessing the changes that you saw from rapid opening up and industrialization, I became very intrigued about how the country was grappling with their environmental issues. Now, am I speaking too quickly, or can everybody hear me? Is the space all right? Yeah? Now, I just want to know who I'm actually addressing. Who actually has an IR background here? Yeah? Okay, who actually has some background in Chinese politics, Chinese area studies? Okay, so it's kind of a mixture, yeah? So what I actually do is I look at basically the domestic imperatives of what China's grappling with in terms of environmental issues and how that's impacting on international issues, like, for example, climate change. So many of you have probably witnessed in the Paris talks that happened last month that people all over the world are quite concerned about limiting global warming or climate change. So they got together in COP21 in Paris to negotiate how to really limit global warming. Now, why China's challenge? Now, I'm actually today going to be talking about what challenges China poses to this global initiative to keep global warming down. And secondly, I want to talk about what kind of domestic challenges China faces when they try to grapple with climate change. Now, climate change is global warming, but we all know it's about emitting emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And basically, China's environmental issue is really tied with their economic issue. So therefore, as they've been really rapidly growing, there's been severe impacts on its economy, which is not just domestic, but also international. So hence, today we're going to be talking about China's challenge to the global climatic change issue, and also what China faces domestically. So the organization of the talk is as follows. So we're going to be talking about, basically, the IR people here would be well aware of this debate, whether China matters, China's rise, China's threat basis. So in the discussion in IR, basically, authors have debated whether or not China really matters in international relations and how much China matters. And this is a broad area covering from traditional security issues to non-traditional security issues. And here we're talking about a non-traditional security issue because we're not talking about military arms, we're not talking about the PLA or the PLAN. We're actually talking about how China's economic development and its impact on the environment has an impact globally. So whether or not China has this kind of environmental influence or influence in the environmental area. So everybody knows what happened in Copenhagen 2009, how much China was a destructivist actor there, and how much China really contributed to the discussions in Paris last month. So here I'm going to be setting up how much China matters. And secondly, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what this whole debate in Paris was about. You hear about climate change, Paris Agreement, so I'm going to give you a bit of background about what's happening in the global sphere that China contributes to and has an impact on. Thirdly, we're going to go into the domestic forces, what's happening domestically in terms of environmental issues such as climate change. And fourthly, we're going to go into global forces. So basically, this is an interaction of what's happening domestically and also globally, because these things like environmental issues are not contained within the domestic boundaries. It goes beyond the boundaries. It's something of a global environmental issue. And then fourthly, I'm going to tie this to recent developments, how we can understand Xi Jinping's policies and what we're seeing recently in terms of the lens of climate change. What are they trying to accomplish? What are they trying to do? And then finally, we're going to be looking at what are the theoretical implications of the findings up to date. So going on, firstly, does China matter? So if you look at the headlines in Paris, and if you look at what happened last month, China is everywhere in terms of climate change. It seems to really matter. It has been the case for the past decade or two in the sense that China has been having an impact in the economy and the environment. And this is basically because if you look around you, if you look at all the pen cases and things you're using, and look at the back, a lot of these things are going to be produced in China. So if you think of China as being the world factory, and all these factories actually emitting emissions and actually contributing to this kind of global warming, if you look at how much of this is actually produced in China, it's not surprising that China is the #1 in global greenhouse gas emissions. So GHG stands for greenhouse gas emissions, and that basically is a combination of CO2 emissions, SO2 emissions, all these emissions that contribute to climate change or global warming. So China is actually #1 in emissions, but it's hard to really understand what does that mean. So just to give you a bit of sort of like a nutshell version of how much China has an impact on this, it's roughly a quarter of the whole global emissions, right? So that's a lot of emissions. A quarter of all the emissions in the world actually come from China. Now, the debate is whether or not, okay, is it fair to really judge this according to how much a country emits? Or is it a better way of understanding this if you divide by each person emitting a certain amount? So the other measurement is this per capita emissions. So the curious thing is China's #1 in emissions, and basically you actually have a quarter of emissions coming here. But if you look at a recent article in the Scientific American, you'll find a very different kind of chart here, right? So basically, I know it's a little bit small for everybody to see, I'm just going to say that's the axis, and China should actually be up here in terms of emissions. But if you swap the measurement to per capita emissions, how much each person is emitting, China falls all the way down here. And not surprisingly, all these countries, where do you think they are? Reading it out to you: Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, UAE, a lot of the oil-producing countries, right? So looking at each person emitting how much emissions, these countries are doing far worse than China. So in that sense, there's this kind of debate in terms of how should we measure, how should we tackle, and all these scientists and all these lawyers and political scientists are debating how best to tackle climate change. And that's basically what's happening in the discussions around Copenhagen and Paris. But setting it up, China really matters. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? Is something I want you to think about and conclude at the very end of the talk. However, why is it really problematic? Okay, it's the sheer amount of greenhouse gas emissions is problematic. But that's not just it. If you look domestically, the source of emissions, right? So looking at energy profile of China. So a country's energy profile means how much of the energy comes from what kind of sources. So in terms of basically China, 66.5% comes from coal. Yeah. And why is this such an issue when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions? Any ideas? Have you ever? Yeah.
Global warming.
Yeah. So basically, coal is the most polluting in terms of global warming. So what's the cleanest energy? Any ideas? Yeah.
Maybe solar?
Yeah, solar is very. Yeah. But what's the problem with solar?
Efficiency.
Efficiency, yeah. So it's very difficult to move from coal to such renewables like solar, wind, or hydro. So this is the issue in terms of basically climate change in China. It's really highly reliant on this problematic source, which is coal. And so you're actually seeing China being the #1 consumer of this problematic source, which emits a lot of CO2 emissions, which contributes heavily to global warming. So basically in this discussion, you have this kind of energy issue. We also have the social issue if you look at China in the sense that there are a lot of people hired in the coal industry. Look at all the coal mines in China. So it's a really social, economic, environmental issue. It's not that easy that all these kinds of, economists think about. It's all about pricing. It's all about what kind of source you use. But this actually has ramifications on the domestic, social, political, economic factors, which makes the issue of the environment really quite complex. And if you actually shift the focus to something like international negotiations, it becomes even more problematic. So if you look at these COP negotiations, which is part of the UN Framework Convention on Climatic Change, you'll see that basically this group of emerging powers, I mean, the IR specialists would know this idea of emerging powers, right? So China, together with, if you look at the basic group, that's kind of giving you the acronym of these countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, for the basic group, right? So these are emerging powers, not quite developed countries, but labeled originally developing, but actually rapidly emerging. So these kinds of rising powers or emerging powers become very problematic in this issue area. Why? If you think about basically these countries, economic development is still very important. So they feel that they have this historical right to develop in the trajectory that the developed countries have gone through. However, they're actually being now grappled with the same kind of emissions caps and basically what to really do about limiting climate change. However, if you look at historical responsibility, should they have the same kind of responsibility as the UK, which went through industrial revolution and emitted a lot of CO2 emissions in that period? They're very clean now, but how do we actually understand this? So it's a really problematic area if you think about ethics and distributive justice as well. However, China really matters. So it's number one emissions, quarter of the world, and also these emerging powers account for 29% of world emissions. And basically, this basic group, these emerging powers, account for 60% of non-Annex 1 emissions. So non-Annex 1 is a terminology from the Kyoto Protocol. Does everybody know what the Kyoto Protocol was? Yeah? So it was one of the initiatives to cut down emissions. And basically they divided the countries into developed countries and developing countries. And developing countries are called the non-Annex 1 countries. And basically back in 1997, China, surprise, surprise, was a developing country. So therefore in non-Annex 1. But in terms of how much these emerging powers matter, they actually account for more than half of the emissions from these developing countries. And currently, the developing countries don't have a limit in how much they can emit. So the number one emitter, quarter of the global emissions, or basically the emerging powers can emit as they like. And basically this was a problem which they addressed in Paris to come up with another framework that would actually universally apply to all countries, not just developed countries. So, compounded with this, you have a very curious shift in terms of China's behavior. So, the IR theorists will be aware of this kind of discussion in the sense that you're actually having a shift in the late 2000s in terms of China's foreign policy behavior. And a lot of the authors like Johnston have called this new assertiveness. So when China came into diplomacy, they were quite quiet and very much, withdrawn. However, it's economically developed, it's become very strong, and it's flexing its muscles. So they're no longer this timid actor in negotiations, but they have this kind of new assertiveness from roughly 2009 onwards. So if you look at the whole equation here in the sense that you actually have a lot of impact in the sense that China matters in climate change. That's basically the ones that are emitting a lot of emissions, the ones that are not emitting emissions. So China matters. They're also becoming more confident, and they're also having a lot of impact on climate change. So China matters. Now, what kind of a regime is climate change that China matters so much? So moving on swiftly to climate change. So this is a crash course basically on what is happening in global governance and climate change. So if there's any questions, just stop me. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to sort of take them as we go along. So in terms of climate change, we have this framework called the UNFCCC, standing for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That came into existence at the Rio Earth Summit. That was happened in '92. And basically all countries got together and said, we really need to combat this thing called climate change. And annually they've been having this conference of parties, or what people call the COPs. And then there are more frequent meeting of the parties. So parties of what? So parties of the convention. So it's a legal treaty or legal agreement that states actually sign on to. And if you're party to it, you actually meet up to say how much further can we go in terms of cutting emissions. And seminal agreements under this UNFCCC were the Kyoto Protocol in '97 and basically the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, which was basically trying to come up with another replacement for the protocol that happened in '97 However, you would remember back in 2009 that China was this obstructivist actor. So China, together with India, really didn't make it a legal agreement possible. Now, what do I mean by a legal agreement possible? An accord is not a legal agreement, right? A protocol has legal binding, whereas accord is just a political statement. So that wasn't good enough, obviously, to address climate change. So we had the states get together, and resulting in the December Paris Agreement. So we're having serious shifts in terms of the way countries approach this. So Kyoto Protocol, that we're actually in the second stage now in 2020, is a top-down. So what do I mean here in this sense? So basically states get together, say they agree on emissions, saying this is how much each country can emit, and they have to basically abide by that. And they divided the countries into non-Annex 1 and Annex 1. But in Paris, they took a very different approach. And this is also quite curious because it also shows China's impact on this kind of negotiation. So China's impact is not just in the regime of climate change, but it also has an impact on the lawmaking in this area. So those of you who actually have studied Chinese history would know that they had a problematic relationship with legal instruments being enforced on them. Just to really give you an example, unequal treaties, those kinds of things actually evoke a very different kind of image when you're actually thinking about legal instruments and binding this. So in terms of Chinese policymakers, it becomes very important that domestically they have complete control of what happens. So this kind of Kyoto framework where it's top-down and international law really matters wasn't something they're quite keen in terms of a model. So what the Chinese have been trying to push in these past couple of years is this kind of bottom-up approach. And that's what you actually found in Paris. So instead of this kind of emissions that they actually decide, they're going to meet every 5 years to agree on this kind of INDC, which is intended nationally determined contributions. So the emphasis here is nationally determined, so it comes from China. So that way it's much easier for China to actually take part in something like this because it's not something enforced externally, but it's something that's actually domestically decided. So in terms of Paris, what have they agreed? So these are just basically the bullet points of what they've agreed. The interesting thing here is that they've agreed to legally sticking by the 2 degrees. However, they're trying to accomplish 1.5. And they aim for 1.7, and they aim for 1.5 degrees warming. But if you actually think about the calculations of what you're allowed to still emit to go for 1.7, some economists have actually done the number crunching, and they've actually been looking at investments in coal, and they anticipate after 2017, one cannot actually invest in coal to reach these Paris targets. So it's a very, very ambitious agreement. And the interesting thing is to see whether or not this can be implemented. So basically, this comes into force when this percentage of countries have actually signed on and ratified. And this is going to be the process for making it a legally binding treaty. So, yeah?
You said there are something ratified? What is it?
So, in international law, so states get together to agree on a treaty or a convention or a protocol. That's an international agreement. However, for example, if you think about how international law is implemented domestically, international law cannot just swim in international law. It has to be implemented in every country, every different jurisdiction. It has to be implemented in China, it has to be implemented in the UK, everywhere, right? So this process of signing a document that we actually sort of send this delegation of people we think are representatives in the environment to places like Paris to agree on something. But what they agree on has to be brought back to the domestic sort of jurisdiction to say, can we do this? And then this kind of signing and ratifying is saying that we are definitely going to do that. And that process is there because if you think about basically systems like the United States, what happened with the Kyoto Protocol? Do you remember what happened? So Al Gore went to Kyoto to say, let's definitely do this protocol. What happened? Did it go through Congress? No. So the United States is not part of the Kyoto Protocol. So in terms of basically democratic systems, you have to then agree to actually implement international law. So it's kind of a two-tier system you have. And this ratification process means that you're going to abide by it domestically. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so after we know what's happening in climate change, let's look at what's happening in terms of the environment in China domestically. So we already know China is actually a #1 consumer of coal, which is a very, very problematic source of energy when you consider climate change. And when did it become #1? So they became #1 when they overtook the United States in 2007. But by that time, there's even that big of a gap between what the Chinese were actually emitting and what the United States was emitting. However, if you go to this kind of World Bank data, you'll see it according to what this pictogram I just showed you earlier from the Scientific American. You can see that all in a table from the World Bank data. But it becomes very different if you think about per capita emissions. So it's a very complex issue when you try to factor in things like distributed justice and what's really fair in terms of thinking about climate change legalization. So China has been actually labeled a non-Annex 1 country under the Kyoto system, meaning they are developing countries. So 97, yes, they were developing. But quite a lot has happened with their double-digit economic development. Slowed down quite a lot. However, it's still quite a big rise if you think about what's happened since 97. So this whole discussion around Paris is how do we get countries like China to come in to commit to more climate change abatement or mitigation when they're maturing. However, they're actually still labeling themselves as developing countries. So this is where the discussion actually has been going internationally. Now, what do the officials in China really actually think about this? Now, if you were an official in China, it becomes a real social problem. How do we actually get clean energy? This is actually linked with coal. How do we get cleaner sources such as natural gas? So what has China been doing? So this is basically investment in clean energy according to country. And I don't know if everybody can read that, but China is at the top there. Followed by the United States, Japan, Germany, UK, Canada, India, Brazil, France, and the Philippines. So you can actually see from this that China has been actually shifting the focus to find cleaner sources and trying to move away from coal. They're looking at alternatives. They're also actually quite active when it comes to this new negotiation framework. So some countries like India were resisting this kind of new system of submitting these nationally determined contributions. But China actually submitted well in time for Paris. So in June, they actually submitted these kinds of targets. However, the fact remains China is still 66.5% reliant on coal. And you can see hydro and clean energy like wind, hydro, and solar. However, it's still pretty small in proportion in comparison to coal. So that really means that it's a very serious issue. They've been grappling with trying to clean their environment. And why are we not actually seeing much more? What does the domestic population say? So according to a survey of the Chinese, Americans, and Japanese on various topics conducted, you can see on the bottom column, you see pollution and environment. So it's not the fact that the Chinese think that in the environment or the pollution is not an important issue. Because if you look at the indicators, it's much higher than what Americans or Japanese think of as important issues. So the Chinese population seems to think it's an important issue. What other factors are they actually pushing or helping the Chinese to really invest or look for other things? Those of you from China or have been to China, everybody will probably know this kind of scene. Well, if you see through the smog, that's actually a picture of Tiananmen. Yeah? So what are we actually seeing here? This air pollution issue, this particles issue. So not exactly climate change, but indirectly linked. It's kind of an external influence if you think about it. Climate change is about clean energy. If you clean energy, your air is going to be cleaner as well. So if you move away from coal, you're going to have less smog as well. So it's in every interest for the Chinese officials to really have a cleaner environment. And what do the population think about it? Does anybody know this? It's the #1 downloaded app in China. And it's called the China Air Quality Index. And what does it do? It tells you about the air quality of your place. And it gives you all the indicators. So if you look at basically what the population is doing and what these people are encountering, it seems very much that it's in every interest to actually combat climate change. And the Chinese have been investing in climate change and doing these kinds of initiatives. So one of the things is basically this clean energy, hydro, wind, and solar. So picking up one example, so that's just a representation geographically of what China has been doing. So we're actually seeing a huge increase. However, if you think about the sheer amount of energy needed to fuel the economies, it's not quite enough. And what other issues are there if you look at this? Yes, great, there's a 75% increase in solar. However, are there any issues with this kind of policy? Got a hand up there? No? Think about where they're located. Okay, so basically to get solar you need panels, you need space. Wind power, you also need windmills, which you need space. So where can you actually put these kinds of windmills or solar panels?
Maybe outskirts of China.
Outskirts of China, where it's not developed, right? Okay. Where is the demand for power, energy? In the outskirts?
No, it's like Beijing or the great cities.
Great cities. And they're not in the outskirts, so they're basically on the coastal regions. But in the coastal regions, can you put the solar power mills and the windmills?
Very hard.
Very hard. So what problem do you have? Exactly what the Chinese officials have. They're placing these things inland. It's great with the Develop the West program that Zhirongji actually pulled in about a couple decades ago. I don't know if you know about this. However, if you think about the loss of energy you have transferring these things towards the coastal regions where the demand is that a solution? So if you think about the Chinese really doing this, however, all the major cities are in the coastal regions, and all this new renewables are located in areas which are quite remote, it's not really a great solution. So in that sense, it's quite a problematic issue that the Chinese officials have to deal with. So I've just given you a rough sketch of what's happening domestically. What are they trying to do internationally? So the interesting thing is the Chinese officials have a very problematic issue that happens domestically in terms of there's a lot of public discontent in terms of the air quality and in terms of addressing the environment. However, there's no quick fixes to this issue. Now internationally, what are they trying to do in climate change? Now this is a list of things I've actually gotten from various interviews and previous research on this topic. So what they're actually trying to do is to use this issue for international status. Now, IR scholars there would all know about international status and how it's so important to actually be a responsible and respectable member of the international community. It's quite a good issue area for China to be very active in. So they're trying to gain international status. They're also using the issue area to develop environmental industries. So as you saw in the earlier slide, this solar panels and renewables and clean energy, this kind of technology and know-how is quite an expensive industry. So they're trying to use this issue area to develop that area. They're also using it to advance sustainable development and obtain aid and technological transfer. Now, what do I mean by this here, in the sense that if you think about this together with lawyers try to devise to incentivize states to emit less. So if you think about economic development, each country wants to economically develop, yet they have this kind of global warming on one hand. However, how do you make it attractive? So the way they actually came about around this in the Kyoto Protocol is to come up with economic mechanisms, so economic benefits. So emissions trading, assigning kind of monetary value to an emission, right? And you can trade it like you do commodities. Other thing is basically clean development mechanism, and this is going to be quite relevant here when we're talking about obtaining aid and technological transfer. So basically this means that a UK company can go into China and clean up a factory. However, China has no emissions cuts that they have to abide by. So whatever emission cut you have there, the UK government can then bring it back to claim and say, this happened and the UK did this. So it's a win-win solution, so they thought. There's various ethical and economic issues with this, but I'm actually simplifying this to explain what's happening here. So in that sense, the Chinese factory or the Chinese government gets this know-how of cleaning up technology from the UK. And that's something they actually obtain. So they're actually contributing towards the cuts in China. So the developing countries are gaining. And the UK is also gaining in the sense that they're actually letting this know-how out to China. However, this is being accredited back to their own emissions. So this kind of system is what was happening inside Kyoto. So it was in China's interest to obtain this kind of aid and technological transfer while these kinds of developed countries were giving it through the clean development mechanism. They also tried to accomplish these other factors like increasing national security, pushing for fair treatment, and exercising leverage. So I'm going to be talking about these various things that China is accomplishing bit by bit, starting from the bottom. So in the lead up to Paris, you actually had last year this agreement with the United States, the U.S.-China agreement on climate change that Obama actually went to China to come up with Xi Jinping on. And this was actually quite seminal in the sense that the two big emitters have agreed to these kinds of goals. So this becomes really quite important, but it also shows that China actually has leverage. China matters in this topic. Where did Hollande go right before Paris? He went to Beijing to come up with the Sino-French agreement. So why are these two agreements so important? And these are the two main agreements which actually pushed through Paris last month. It shows you that China actually has quite a lot of leverage and importance in the issue area. However, China is a really complex country. We have basically this kind of very powerful state when it comes to this issue area, but we also have this kind of developing country kind of traits in the sense if we look at the UN Human Development Index, which is a problematic index, however, it's an interesting way of looking at development and stages of development. China actually qualifies as a medium developed country. It's also got issues when you look at institutions. The real law is really weak, and you actually have very weak institutions if you look at it domestically. So when these things are accountable for such things like greenhouse gas emissions, it becomes rather problematic. And in terms of basically technological investments, we saw that they actually put a lot of emphasis on renewables. However, in terms of policy outcomes, it doesn't really tackle this problem of over-reliance on coal. So it's a really complex state if you look at this kind of size and influence in this issue area, which is a major power, the sheer population, the gross amount of emissions, and their negotiating impact on this. However, if you look at basically domestically, they're quite weak in terms of institutional capacity and also rule of law. So you're actually having a very complex state, but a very important state in this issue area. So what do I mean by weak institutions? I'm talking about basically what exists domestically. So when negotiators represent China in places like Paris, they sign on to the dotted line, but China brings it back. But implementing this becomes a group exercise. So it's not a monolithic country. So you have state council that really is at the top, it's a super ministry, and all these various ministries like environmental protection, agriculture, because you're dealing with sinking gases, things like commerce also come in, and foreign affairs come in because this is a very strategic issue. And this kind of bureaucratic organization in the central level is also mirrored at the local level. And for things like CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, and emissions to be accounted for internationally by the Chinese, you have to have very smooth communication channels at various levels. Now, scholars of Chinese studies will really know this area, like central-local relations, which is a big theme in Chinese politics, that basically the central doesn't really know what the local is doing and vice versa. So because of the reforms after Deng Xiaoping and decentralization, you're having a lot of decentralization and things allocated to various levels. But that only works when you have communication channels working quite healthy. However, we actually see that this kind of issue becomes a serious issue when it comes to accountability of greenhouse gas emissions. And that was part of the issue that China had in Copenhagen, is promising cuts when they're not able to keep books on greenhouse gas emissions. And looking at CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, this idea of basically cooperation between China and the UK that I was talking about. The interesting thing is basically that is what existed in terms of the breakdown of CDMs. So basically, developed countries investing in developing countries, what kind of developing country partners have they chosen? So this is back from 2008, and this is from the UN website. So we actually see China in the green there, which is only 16.7%, and that red bit is India. And we can actually see little countries like Brazil, Mexico, Malaysia, Chile, Republic of Korea, others. Now, what can you tell from this pie chart? Half of them are focused on India and China, and they're really attractive. Now, this is 2008. What do you think happens when we actually fast forward the clock to the now? So, more than half is in China, 50.31%. So, what does this tell us about aid, technological transfer in climate change? Where is it going? Why is China so attractive? Or why is China so good at attracting us? Things to really think about. So what we're actually seeing in terms of China, yes, they're admitting they're actually being quite impactful in this issue area. However, if you look at the efficiency, it's actually doing quite well. Now, after we've talked a bit about the issue area, China mattering, some of the complex issues they face internationally and domestically, I want to tie it to what we're actually seeing in terms of this recent developments. So under Xi Jinping, what kind of changes are we actually seeing? Now, one of the things he's pushing forward is this new normal. Everybody's heard of the new normal, right? So what does a new normal mean in terms of when we think about climate change? So he's saying things are actually slowing down. The new normal is actually not this double-digit economy. So this is actually preparing the population for slowing down the economy that also allows him this kind of opportunity to address things like climate change. So moving to cleaner sources is not going to make the economy much more efficient in the sense because the startup process is going to be quite problematic and you're going to not have a lot of efficiency in terms of climate emissions efficiency. The curious thing, however, is they're not just stopping there. They're also expanding beyond their borders to address this kind of issue. So everybody knows the one road, one belt, right? So what does the one road, one belt mean? So basically Xi Jinping is envisioning this road going in the mainland and basically this belt on the sea. Now, the interesting thing is basically this is actually coinciding with what we're actually seeing in terms of developments in the sea regions, right? So if you look at things like the South China Sea, what do we actually see? Pictures like this. Okay, so that's actually South Johnson's Reef. So what are the Chinese doing here? Yeah?
These are contested islands and a lot of countries in the region have a claim to them. So apparently there's been a lot of activity in the region with China basically putting land on top of the islands so that they are legitimate islands where people could essentially live so that they have a claim to them. And that's all to control the South China Sea.
Okay, so let me stop you there at the last sentence. It's to control the South China Sea, right? Contested islands, there's a sovereignty issue, territorial waters, right? So the interesting is what you said at the very end. What is motivating China, right? So you think it's to control the islands and control the waters?
Control the passageway for trade.
Okay. And what is that bringing?
I don't know.
Straits of Malacca? Where does this all go? Okay, so South China Sea is right there, right? So we're talking about the side. So if you actually have a safe passage there, you're absolutely right, but I want you to expand on that point.
It makes it has unprecedented access to the route, and so it doesn't have to, say, divert to different areas and it could be more costly.
Yeah. So what? Yeah. Anything to add to
It
that?
enhances their energy security because if they've got the monopoly of that area and they're building these artificial dams, so they can claim a kind of 30-mile radius around the South China Sea, and they've also securing their own borders as well as their energy security through Straits of Malacca and South China Sea.
Great. So unpacking what you've just said there, this is actually quite important for their traditional security issues in the sense that this is actually safe passage, right? So you're actually having the PLA Navy for you to go there if it's your territory. It becomes your territorial waters. Another thing is basically claiming territoriality. You've actually got access to things like the continental shelf. So this bit here, you're not going to get any energy here. But what if you actually drill off of here to find something like natural gas deposits? Right? Who has claims to it? So by claiming this, you actually have this as your sovereign area, expanding your territorial waters. You can fish all you want there because it becomes your territorial water. And if you have deposits of gas, who has access to that? Oil rights. China. So it's actually something that can't be ignored because you do have potential for natural gas deposits and oil, right? And the final thing is safe passage, the sea lanes of communication, right? So this is actually a very strategic area in the sense to get anything up to China safely from the Middle East, where they have cleaner sources of energy, you're going to have to go through here. So this is a very key strategic issue. And it's not all about security, and it's not all about territory. If you think about basically what's important for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party today, it's not really communism anymore if you think about legitimacy of the party. So they're actually relying on this kind of economic development. So this economic development is only possible if you have the sources to fuel that economic development. And if the sources are being ruled out, like coal, if you have to cut down on emissions, the access to these kinds of cleaner sources is going to become more and more important. So therefore, you actually have things like this and things like that. Okay, so shifting the focus north. What am I showing you here? Big hint, what's the title? East China Sea. What does that have to do with energy here? Okay, why are the Chinese and the Japanese at each other's throats for this kind of tiny little or reef? If you read the deposit a bit further up from the Diaoyu Islands, you actually have what the UN report had said is the biggest deposit of natural resources. That is bigger than any other Middle Eastern country. And that's what the 68 report of the UN said. And curiously enough, that is when you actually had the two countries more interested in the area. Prior to that, territorial waters, those kind of things really matter. However, if you think about basically the 70s, 80s, you're thinking about basically these two countries really still going up on their economic development and natural resources really maturing. And the lack of natural resources that one has in their own land and the clean gas deposits that they have becomes a very problematic issue area. So what I'm actually trying to say here in a sense is that if you look at these issue areas like South China Sea and the East China Sea, it's often really labeled as it's an issue of nationalism, it's an issue about security. However, one forgotten dimension is this issue area of energy and how this has an influence in these kinds of debates. What else is Xi Jinping doing? He's also trying to actually take the pressure off this new normal. So basically he's actually saying that we're slowing down economic development, which has an impact on coal. We're cutting down on coal. We're trying to cut down on emissions. So another thing that one can do is, rather than this kind of one belt, is people have been seeing in the news China in Africa, China in Latin America, China in Central Asia. Now, what are these kind of outward actions of China really targeting? Where are the investments going? The interesting thing is if you look at basically the investments that China has on the African continent, surprise, surprise, a lot of natural resources and energy. So in that sense, we're actually having this kind of dynamism in terms of what China is doing globally that is actually factored a certain deal by this kind of energy need. And there is also actually this kind of national security law that came in 2015 that really talks about how the environment is a serious issue that we have to grapple with. So with that in mind, what are the theoretical implications of what we're actually seeing in China and climate change? So the interesting thing to flag here is internationally, those of you working on IR, this is a really interesting era of basically global governance in climate change. You're actually seeing a real shift in terms of the Kyoto system to the Paris system. And this is also happening at a time that China is much more confident and assertive. So you're actually seeing this kind of China in the headlines quite a lot. You can see the head of delegations in Paris, he was quite vocal at the negotiations. And although he's actually quite vocal, he's quite good about not really going ahead of it on their own, in the sense that traditionally China has negotiated with developing countries of the G77, which is the biggest UN coalition group of 77 in negotiations made up of developing countries. Also, the basic group that China actually put together, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, that are emerging countries that have very overlapping interests in climate change. And also keeping intact with basically the very important actors like the United States and France. So you're actually seeing this kind of shift, the Paris flexible system, the bottom-up system, really fitting in with things like the Chinese legal culture. So one thing is, practically speaking, with this kind of central-local problem, this flexible system, bottom-up, makes it much more easier for China to participate and take part in such a framework. And also this idea that basically the domestic jurisdiction is in charge is really appealing for the Chinese legal culture. So a lot of sociologists and legal authors have actually talked about the Chinese legal culture and how they're actually really putting an emphasis on domestic sort of jurisdiction and how domestic decisions matter most. Another interesting thing we're actually seeing here is that basically this long-age debate in Chinese studies about basically substantial reform and superficial reform. And those of you from China would probably know this kind of idea of this kind of real substantial reform to something that's actually shooty or actually superficial. So basically in terms of China, they're actually doing quite a lot in terms of, pilot projects to signal they're actually investing in renewables. But in terms of what's happening in things like legislation on fuel. So in terms of fuel legislation, there's been a lot of lag in terms of having more stringent standards. And that's actually partly because a lot of the people on this final legislative committees tend to come from the government and also massive SOEs who have a vested interest in actually emitting more emissions. So in that sense, are we actually seeing the case that we're actually having showcased reforms that really are more superficial than actually tackling the real issues, like getting rid of those coal mines and tackling those kind of social problems? So if we move away from coal, what do we do with this kind of massive unemployment and displaced people? So there's various theoretical implications of just looking at climate change from the dimension of international, domestic, and also local. So today we've actually talked about China mattering, and I don't think anybody's going to be disputing the fact that China matters. It's just the question of to what extent. Their influence is quite enormous in the issue area, and also in the sense having an impact on global governance. It's the real reason why we're actually seeing this, why we keep seeing these kinds of shifts. However, if you actually shift the focus domestically, this is a serious issue and a challenging one for the CCP. And finally, we've actually linked it to recent developments and also what kind of theoretical implications we can see from looking at this kind of empirical data. So basically, that's all I have to really say about this topic. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. And if you are interested in reading a little bit more, just go to the SOAS website. And if you're interested in studying about it more, I run a one-year master's course on politics of China with my colleagues, where we cover international politics, domestic politics, and cross straits. So if you have any questions, that's my email address there. If you want to actually ask me now, I'm happy to take any questions. Okay. Thank you very much.
This is over there.
Thank you.
Gift card. Thank you very much. Arigatou gozaimasu.
One, two, three.